Alright boys, let's talk. I've been posting about Dead by Daylight lore for about a year and a half now, and one of the most common questions I get is why are some of the killers canonically good people in their lore? So I figured I'd answer that as best I can. This requires a basic understanding of the overall lore for DBD. Essentially what you need to know is that there's this god of evil called the Entity. The Entity feeds off of emotions like bloodlust, rage, hope, and despair, and does so by abducting people from their homeworlds and forcing them to compete against each other. Some of these people are chosen to be killers, and some are chosen to be survivors. The confusion lies in the fact that a lot of those who are chosen to be killers aren't necessarily evil people, they just have sad backstories. Let's take Carmina Mora, or the artist, for example. She blames herself for the death of her brother, attempts to end her life, and is stopped by a murder of crows. Since crows aren't native to her home country of Chile, she sees this as some sort of divine intervention. She then turns to art and poetry to find meaning in life, and uses her talent to stand up to the fascist regime in her country. A shadowy organization then abducts Carmina and her friends, they chop off her hands and her tongue so she can't paint or recite poetry anymore, and suddenly a murder of crows reappears and kills both her abductors and her friends. After this, Carmina is taken by the Entity and transformed into the artist, a killer. Reading this, you don't really think, oh, this Carmina really seems like a killer. She's not evil. In fact, she stood up to her oppressors her whole life. And she didn't kill a single person in her backstory. She's just somebody who couldn't really catch a break. But still, she was chosen to be a killer. Why is that? It's because the Entity doesn't necessarily need to feed off of evil. The Entity is the literal essence of evil. It has a surplus of it. What the Entity needs, though, is emotion. I mentioned before that the main emotions it feeds off of are bloodlust, rage, hope, and despair. The killers and survivors aren't categorized based on how good or how evil they are. There are some pretty bad survivors, and there are some pretty good killers. They're categorized based on what emotions drive them. In Carmina's lore, the first emotion she experiences when she has her hands and tongue removed is uncontrollable rage. Then, when her friends are killed by the flock of crows, her first instinct isn't to feel sad or scared. It says her heart lurched with rage when she saw the crows move on them. Despite being a good person who dedicated her life to a good cause, Carmina's dominant emotion after being broken down was rage. With that perspective, it becomes clear that the Entity sent the flock of crows to stop her from ending her own life, not to give her hope, but to help her build up a life, only to break it all down and eventually let her experience the rage that the Entity knew she was capable of feeling. Knowing this helps us draw conclusions on the other killers who are canonically good people. The Wraith, for example, gave into rage first when he lit a group of mercenaries on fire after they killed his family, and again when he dismembered his boss after he found out that his boss was working with the Mafia. The spirit was driven by rage and bloodlust through her childhood, and kept it under control until her father went nuts and started hacking the family to bits. The plague wasn't necessarily driven by rage, but she was spilling blood of innocent people from a very young age because that's what her religion told her to do. The Entity simply saw this bloodlust, saw this rage, and assisted in breaking these people down until the Entity could manipulate them into redirecting that rage towards survivors. Hell, even the Trapper, whose lore states that he committed the single largest mass murder event in modern history, was tortured into compliance, as evidenced by his disfiguration. So the key takeaway from this should be that Dead by Daylight, from a lore perspective, is not necessarily a killer versus survivor story. The killers and survivors are just being manipulated into believing that it is by the Entity, and the Entity is the one who is truly in power. This is something that we see reflected in real life pretty often, unfortunately, and hopefully we can start recognizing it a little more. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider leaving a like and sharing it with a friend that has had the same question. Comment below for any video game lore questions you may have, and take care of yourselves. I've been freaking Nick, and it's been a pleasure talking with you today.